Good morning, friends. In this module, we shall be studying about Romanticism in architecture, literature, sculpture and music. Our objectives in learning this module will be as follows. Gather associated information about architecture, sculpture, music and literature. Understand the linkages between literature and visual arts. Examine some poems to understand the thematic. We shall be looking at the following components: Romanticism in architecture, Romanticism in music, Romanticism in literature. The novel, let us start with architecture. In architecture, Romanticism asked for the revival of historical styles. Neoclassicism in architecture had allowed for grandeur and timelessness in secular public buildings. But Romanticism evoked, for instance, the Gothic past with its association of spirituality and community. In America, too, Jefferson revived ancient Greek and Roman forms, which were ideologically appropriate for the newly founded American democracy. It did begin in Germany and England, but became very famous throughout Europe and the world. It was very popular with the aristocracy, who fulfilled their fantasy of living in a fairy tale like house. The romantic in architecture era was like fairy tale setting which aimed to stress the importance of nature with grand castles and extremely decorative towers based upon medieval cathedrals, only in a more fanciful than Gothic style. Only in more fanciful than Gothic style. Other influences termed exotic and orientalist were also in fashion. Egyptian influenced homes, Asian style homes or Swiss chalice with Japanese inspired roofliness. Egyptian columns and small springs sculptures coexisted with Indian and Chinese style of architecture. The best example here is the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, London, built by John Nash, 1552 to 1835, for the Prince Regent George IV in the Indian Gothic style, as is a seaside home. A series of opinion domes along the roof, minarets flanking the central dome, front porch with Moorish horseshoe arches and pseudo-Gothic bifurcated windows. Chinese interiors are all features of romantic architecture. Let us now look at the Houses of Parliament, London. We do remember the painting by J.M.W. Turner showing us the fire that destroyed the original building. Well, when the British government announced a competition for a new building to be designed in English perpendicular Gothic style and to harmonize with neighboring Westminster Abbey, the 13th century church where English monarchs are crowned, and Augustus Welby Northmore Puggin won. Barry developed the symmetry in the buildings, suggesting the balance of powers within the British parliamentary system, and Puggin provided the intricate Gothic decoration laid over Barry's essentially classical plan. For Barry, the Gothic showcased two great rules of architecture. First, that there should be no features about a building which are not necessary for convenience, construction and propriety. Second, that all ornament should consist of enrichment of the essential structure of building. In America, these ideas can be seen in the most ornate Italianate style house in the United States. In the famous Breaker's house overlooking the ocean in use in Newport, Rhode Island, designed by Richard Morris Hunt in the 1890s for Cornelius Vanderbilt. This 70-room mansion featured a 3-part stone facade where porticos open at both the ground level and the upper story to allow views of the surrounding countryside. A vacation home made for the wealthy in stone, the Italian Renaissance inspired this building. The central porticos are flanked by wings on either side, while many more modest Italianate homes are made of wood and feature modified Victorian woodwork. This stone house represents, while many more modest Italianate homes are made of wood and feature modified Victorian woodwork. This stone house represents the most monumental form of the Italianate style, clearly a vacation home for the wealthy. The breakers takes its cue from the Italian Renaissance villa type to create a visual reference between the Vanderbilt family and the established aristocratic families of Europe, who were widely viewed at this time as more culturally refined than their American counterparts. Swiss chalet style homes also became a huge hit in the US, especially with the middle classes, as it was affordable. It was introduced by Andrew Jackson Downing in 1850. Sculpture. Just as romantic painting can be divided into figure and landscape works, so can romantic sculpture be divided into works that concern the human world and natural world. The leading sculptors of each type are Francois Rude and Barry. Respectively, Rude's stone sculpture was originally titled The Departure of the Volunteers of 1792, but generally known as La Marseillaise, was one of the 4 reliefs added to the Arch de Triomphe in Paris. Look at the group of volunteers answering the call to arms in defense of France against foreign enemies, and the rhythmic energy of their motion. His soldiers are young and old, and either nude or equipped with classical armor. They have given in to passion and excitement reflected in the painting. Unlike the orderliness of neoclassical patriotism, vigorously striding above the volunteers and driving them on is an allegory of liberty, a 19th century revolutionary version of the traditional winged victory. Antoine-Louis Barye was a French sculptor most famous for his work as an animalier, a sculptor of animals. He studied the anatomy of his subjects by sketching residents of the Paris Zoo. Most of his works consist of single animals or predators. The scale of Barye's work ranges from monuments to figurines. Romanticism in music. Romanticism in music emerged out of general impatience with the rules and restraints of classicism, and the music revolted against the practices of Mozart and Haydn. In a reflection of one's own feelings and emotions, music became very individualistic. The sparking of the imagination were a primary goal. The composer did not need a patron anymore. He would perform in front of the upcoming middle class, the bourgeoisie, emulating the aristocracy. in an exclusive salon, standing outside the circle of the exclusive salon was a large but unorganized and unsophisticated concert-going public which loved music. Romantic composers were constantly striving to gain recognition of this large audience and in an effort to win acceptance. They were very sensitive to the likes and dislikes of these music lovers. About 1820, Beethoven began to write passionate composition which often threatened to burst asunder the classical forms in which he worked. His 1824 Symphony No. 9 is notable not only for its length and complexity, but for the fact that he introduced vocal soloists and a chorus into the final movement, as if the purely instrumental form of the classical symphony could not express all that he felt. After his radical departure from tradition, many composers felt free to experiment. The church was no longer considered a patron of music, with very little music written for liturgical purposes. The teaching of music, however, became an established profession. Many fine conservatories and schools of music were founded for the education of performing and creative musicians. Beethoven is also significant in the history of music for being the first composer to earn his living directly from his own work without being subsidized by a church or an aristocrat. Romanticism in literature. Romanticism transformed poetry, sculpture and music, especially opera. It was also known as the picturesque and was interpreted as an artistic and intellectual movement. Romanticism emphasizes strong emotion, spirituality and creativity, drama and religion. Romanticism in English literature began in the 1790s with the publication of lyrical ballads of William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Wordsworth's preface to the second edition in 1800 of the lyrical ballads, in which he described poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, became the manifesto of the English Romantic movement in poetry. William Blake was the third principal poet of the movement's early phase in England. The first phase of Romantic movement in Germany was marked by innovations in both content and literary style and by preoccupation with the mystical, the subconscious and the supernatural. A wealth of talents including Friedrich Hölderlin, the early Johann, Wolfgang von Goethe, Jean-Paul Novelis, Ludwig Tieck and Friedrich Schlegel, Wilhelm Heinrich Wackenroder and Friedrich Salings belong to this first phase. In revolutionary France, the Vicomte de Chateaubriand and Mamie de Staël were the chief initiators of Romanticism by virtue of their influential historical and theoretical writings. The second phase of Romanticism, comprising the period from about 1805 to the 1830s, was marked by quickening of cultural nationalism and a new attention to national origins, as attested by the collection and imitation of the native folk ballads and poetry, folk dance and music, and even previously ignored medieval and Renaissance works. The revived historical appreciation was translated into imaginative writing by Sir Walter Scott, who is often considered to have invented the historical novel. At about this same time, English Romantic poetry had reached its zenith in the works of John Keats, Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley, a notable byproduct of romantic interest in the emotional, were works dealing with the supernatural, the weird and the horrible, as in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and works by C.R. Maturin and the Marquis de Sade and E.T.A. Hoffmann. The second phase of Romanticism in Germany was dominated by Achim von Arnim and Clemens Brentano, J.J. von Goris and Joseph von Eichendorff and Joseph von Eichendorff. It was a deliberate and sweeping revolt against literary principles of the Age of Reason. The neoclassical writing was characterized by reason or common sense in matter expressed in the restrained style with order, proportion and finish. Romantic writing is characterized by imagination in matter expressed in a style more or less free of restraint, a style which may be simple or grand, picturesque or passionate, depending on the moods or temperament of the writer. In other words, Romanticism subordinates form to matter and stands for informality and freedom. Desire for imaginative freedom, passion for nature, yearning for the past, these were impulses had been stirring throughout the 19th century, leading to the Romantic period. The Romantic writers look upon nature now with points of view that were previously unknown. The external influences that led to this movement were the French Revolution and the German literature. Germany had already taken great strides in poetry and drama under Goethe and Sels, and in philosophy under Kant and Schelling during the second half of the 19th century. Kant's philosophy especially rejected the materialistic interpretations of the universe and held that reality as a spiritual essence transcends sensory experiences. The French Revolution ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity were the guiding principles for this age and the later to come. The Romantics returned to the beauties of external nature, the simple life of rustic folk in close communion with nature, etc. Wordsworth's Solitary Reaper conveys a sense of melancholic openness of humanity with an all-encompassing nature. When seen by the poet, the reaper is alone in a vast expanse of land. Other English poets of the Romantic movement included Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley and John Keats. If Wordsworth spiritualized nature, Coleridge turned to metaphysical aspects of nature. Shelley invests the objects of nature with a celestial gleam and sees the nature, the promise of millennium to mankind. Keats' love of nature is deeply sensuous, not spiritual or intellectual. To Byron, nature is just backdrop to human moods and feelings. He portrays it realistically with very little mystery. I love nature in her stormier moods. Here we look at Byron's nostalgic yearning for ancient Greece as evident in much of his poetry. In Byron, you will also see a note of revolt, ranging from mild reaction to bitter protest. Look at these lines in Don Juan. Shelley's Ozymandias evokes the attraction of exotic locales and explores our ability to communicate with the past through time-worn artifacts. The concern for common men is another theme in the Romantic poetry. The Romantics wrote about the village preacher or schoolmaster or the blacksmith. William Blake's poems, though laden with religious symbolism, is essentially about the common people, the downtrodden. Et al. Look at his songs of innocence and songs of experience. The novel. In the 18th century, Daniel Defoe, Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding are generally regarded as fathers of English novel, though they did not constitute a literary school. In the 19th century Britain, Sir Walter Scott's Waverley, 1840, about the 1745 Jacobite uprising in support of Charles Edward Stuart, inaugurated the historical novel. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, 1813, and Emma, 1816, contemplating and satirizing life among a small group of country gentry in Regency, England, initiated the highly structured and polished novel of manners. A variant with a wider scope is William Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair, 1847 to 1848, which dissects and satirizes London society. The serialization of novels in various periodicals brought the form an ever-expanding audience. Particularly popular were the works of Charles Dickens, including Oliver Twist, 1839, and David Copperfield, 1850. Readers were drawn by Dickens' sympathetic, melodramatic, and humorous delineation of the world peopled with characters of all social classes. And by his condemnation of various social abuses. Further, portraits of English society appear in George Eliot's Silas Marner, 1871 to 1872, which treat the lives of ordinary people in provincial towns with humility and strong moral sense. The conflict between man and nature is stressed in Thomas Hardy's Return of the Native, 1878, and Tastes of the D'Urberville in 1891. Although the great English novels of the 19th century were predominantly realistic, novels of fantasy romance formed a literary undercurrent. Early in the century, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein explores a tale of horror. Later, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights each presents imaginative, passionate visions of human love. Robert Louis Stevenson revived the adventure tale and the horror story in Treasure Island, and the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. At the beginning of the 20th century, horror and adventure were combined in the novels of Joseph Conrad, notably Lord Jim and Heart of Darkness, both works achieving high levels of stylistic and psychological sophistication. American novels in the 19th century were explicitly referred to as romances. James Fenimore Cooper's historical novel, The Last of the Mohicans, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, and Herman Melville's Moby Dick, the latter two heavily allegorical and containing supernatural elements, properly belong in this category. In the last decades of the century, however, a shift towards realism occurred. Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a revival of the picaresque novel, is romantic in its Mississippi River setting but realistic in its satirical attack on religious hypocrisy and racial persecutions. By the end of the century, Henry James had brought his moral vision and towers of psychological observation to the novel in numerous works, including The Portrait of a Lady in 1881 and The Spoils of Poynton in 1897 and The Ambassadors 1903. These novels are not only masterpieces of realism but also in their carefully crafted form, experimental point of view and superb style. Supreme examples of the novel as a literary genre.